Yeah, good morning, and thanks for the invitation and this fascinating symposia. I really like this. I mean, there are many familiar faces. Of course, we have been discussing within HPP these topics for a while, but there are also some unfamiliar faces. So I'm hoping that we are reaching you, and that's what you expected from the title. From cortical microcircuits to consciousness, of course, it's a fascinating challenge because it bridges multi-scales. So I'm going to take my perspective on it will be, so usually I do human fMRI, and so I'll talk about some of our research that we're doing in Glasgow, but I also highlight some of the other research we are doing in collaboration with across HPP. And I'm trying to make a bridge between different talks. This is a bit of a selection, but actually there are many, many more links. But you see how and why some of the themes are coming up again, especially from Matthew Larcom's talk yesterday and from Johan Storm's talk just now, and I hope Walter Sand will then continue. Let me start by motivating cortical feedback. So that's my title, but cortical feedback only. So let's start with going extreme and looking at the visual cortex and only at cortical top-down feedback. Then later on I will talk about feedback integration with feed-forward. But the extreme case, so to say, I start with these paintings. So they're beautiful visual paintings, and so you wonder why that is top-down. Well, the artist Sarji Man, when he painted these paintings, was entirely blind at that time in life. And so, they are triggered by purely internal models of the world. And the richness of internal models is what I want to start with. A line of research from Joseph Feiser's lab on ferrets used degraded stimuli. So it starts on the left. Do you have a pointer? Let me just get a pointer. So here it starts out with rich visual stimuli, but then during the experiment they are degraded in contrast up to a point where there's no stimulus, and they're recording from several units, and they get these multidimensional feature space that you get from multi-units, and they wonder how they are comparing in these dark rooms recording to the these are the effectively, these are the priors, so the internal models the ferrets have about the world, and how do they compare to natural stimuli or to artificial stimuli like these gratings. And they also do this over lifetimes, so they start the recordings in very young animals and then go to adult animals, and what you can see is that these priors at first are not very much tuned. They're neither correlated to the outside world nor correlated to these ideal stimuli like gratings. But over lifetime, they become very much tuned to the outside world, not to the ideal grating stimuli. So you can see that these priors, what ferrets are dreaming about once it's dark and you have this activity, is really about outside features. We did blindfold our subjects, and we looked into visual cortex. We played them sounds, and you can do this yourself if you close your eyes now and listen to the sounds. So we have these complex visual auditory scenes, and we record, we do retrotopic mapping from early visual areas, and then we do multivoxel pattern classification. So that's a pattern analysis from the first runs. So we have 3 runs, and then we train our classifiers, and then we extrapolate to the 4th run, and in the 4th run the classifier is saying which sound the subject were listening to based on the brain activity in V1. And that becomes significant in early visual cortex. And we also looked into a kind of retinotopic feature from fovea periphery to far periphery, and it is something that becomes stronger in the periphery and far periphery. We then also, we had many controls in this experiment, but we also had a group of subjects that were blind from birth, and we redid the study. There's a challenge to do retinotopic mapping. Isn't possible, but you can do cortical-based alignment and get a precision around 90% of their early visual cortex. And again, we found that we can classify, we can read out from the visual cortex and know what kind of sounds were played. And it has this pattern, and if anything, it's more extreme from fovea to periphery. It gets stronger and stronger. So what is the visual cortex good for? In this case, it's not for vision, especially in the blind subjects, but maybe it's for this sense of space. They navigate, and they, blind subjects have also a sense of space. I came across this this paper recently that is the only one, or it claims the first one, and one of the only one to approach the hard problem of consciousness, which is the qualia problem. So how is it to experience qualia of like pain and redness and so on? These are the hard problems of consciousness. So Andrew Howne and Giulio Tononi addressed this not in those examples where it's particularly hard, but they start with the qualia of space, because that can be more formalized. And so in their paper, they expand the idea that spatial experience is maybe more penetrable for introspection. Spatial maps are ubiquitous, so it's not only vision, but it's also body space, and so we have these cause effect structures of a grid pattern in other areas as well, maybe for time in auditory cortex. But for spatial experience, it appears as if it's painted on a canvas, and it has a number of phenomenal distinctions and relations. So one is like the extendedness. Now you can break down extendedness to be consisting of countless spots here and there, small and large, and you can formulate that relationships to one another, so they are connected, they can fuse in shapes, and they can be inclusions, and these kind of extendedness, exclosure, location, size, boundary, distance, and so on, you can formalize. And you can formalize in a kind of a cause-effect structure that is very well captured in the grid-light structure. So their neighborhood relationships, inclusiveness, and so on. And so the claim of that IIT theory is that qualia is of spatial a sense of space is somehow incorporated in this cause-effect structures of those cortical grids. And if we look at early visual cortex or retinotopic cortex, of course it's formed like a grid, and it has feedback from many other sensory areas that contributes to activation or inactivation of that space, and so therefore it could contribute to the sense of space. Now I want to level up a little bit of the levels of consciousness. So my first examples were consciousness, but not of a visual feature in blind and blindfolded, but more a consciousness of the multisensory induced sense of space. Another level of sense of space that comes next is more related to world knowledge and the temporal history of context for visual processing. So it's kind of the idea of being situated. After one of my talks, one of the paper, I got a reader saying she wakes up for 20 years, has a different house, but when she wakes up there, it takes her a moment in which she doesn't realize which house it is, so it takes a while to realize the kind of shape and situatedness, right? And that's usually when we awake state, we are very much situated when we reach for a coffee or when we go outside. We have certain expectations, what's surrounding us or what's behind me and so on. But not having this situatedness is, of course, a level of degraded consciousness. And so the next examples feed into that, but they are much better controlled. So an example I've been using for years is this occlusion paradigm. It's a very simplified version of natural visual stimuli that have one big patch in usually the right lower visual field where it's white and it's just occluding. Now you have occlusions everywhere. If you have a cup of coffee or two people standing or this object, the visual system is automatically understanding what's behind occluded objects, full persons, full hands, figures, and all of this. And so the same applies in these situations. We asked 50 subjects to draw on an iPad what was missing in this visual information, and they very consistently, we just overlaid all of those responses, and you can see they are very well aligned with probably your own expectations as well. So these are the kind of mental line drawings that automatically fill in and leave out some of the details. We have recorded, and this is in a context, it draws from your world experience. The Faraday example I said earlier, it's just automatically that we have these expectations and they're feeding back into visual cortex. This aligns itself to the theory of the predictive processing, or indeed other theories, apical amplification or dendrical inclusion theory, is that? And in which we are proposing that there is a cellular microcircuit mechanism that is doing this integration and is in a hierarchical system in which it receives feedback from many other areas. Now, how do we explore this experimentally? This is high-resolution fMRI at 7T. We will do layer-specific fMRI. We do retinotopic mapping of this occluded region. This is the occluded region retinotopically. This is a surround area which we keep away from to be sure that we are in the center. Then we do layer-specific fMRI. So if we turn around, you see these rainbow colors that reflect 6 different layers equally spaced. They're not really anatomical layers, but they're trying to get there. And we are sampling fMRI data at these different depth levels. And then we do, again, multivoxel pattern classification, so a brain reading algorithm in which we're asking, can this layer in early visual cortex in V1 know what kind of visual stimulus is presented in the surround? We do this in normal, full-blown visual stimulation. That is a sanity check. MVPA works well there. We train on 3 runs, predict the 4th run, and do different folds of that. But then if we have occluded situations, can we still know whether this is a car and this is a ship? And our early findings showed that yes, that's possible, but only in the superficial layers of V1. So to summarize that, we think that in these superficial layers of V1, the red region that you see here, there is information about the cortical feedback that is coming from the surround visual stimulation, and we have modeled this activity and expanded other experiments, and we can compare that to different models, and it relates best to the idea that it's mental line drawings. So we took the line drawings I presented earlier and correlated them to the activity profiles, and they are the best predictors. So in a way, you see the effect of the mental line drawing in occlusions in early visual cortex. And it's kind of lingering in the superficial layers, so that's the dendritic, the dendritic bed of these layer 5 pyramidal cells potentially as hypothesis that can be read out. And that can have very useful effects. It could be synergetically integrating this kind of expectations or tune the feed-forward context, the feed-forward input, to the context that is provided by either world knowledge, specific expectations, and just make it conscious. Now, to explore this on a multi-scale level with other experiments, we collaborated with Christian Liefeld's lab, and Koen Sidnet did wide field imaging in mice and used 2-photon calcium imaging. And they used the similar stimuli, measured receptive fields. Here you see the receptive field mapping. They also stayed away from the boundary, so used the core receptive fields, or only those neurons that are really stayed away from the boundary, and looked at their response pattern for a full stimulus or the occluded stimulus. And as you can see, these recording patterns have these transient increases in activity, and peristimulus time histogram shows you that there's clear response to the occluded stimuli in these superficial layers of mice. There are some, after training, so there are some more details which I will not go into. You also see a delay of 30 to 60 milliseconds between this wave of the occlusioners. So it is following a pattern, analysis of the surround stimulus that is then recognized to be, in this case, a forest, and to generate an internal mental line drawing, if you like, of the missing information, that these trees don't stop here but continue, and that is then sent down to V1, and that triggers the second wave. Now, as Johan Storm already showed, and from yesterday's talks as well, many of the modern theories about consciousness talk about this recurrency. For example, Victor Lamme's approach, and the global workspace theory, Gaudier's theory also of this kind of different levels of consciousness and the reflection of how much it is important to have these recurrencies, and Peter's status of the ignition as well. Matthew Larkham presented this idea in this 2013 paper that the superficial layers are integral part of combining these features or predictions. So that's the way we see it. In a way, this is an animation Angus patented in my lab, in which you can see there are these two streams, one feed-forward stream and then the feedback stream that is always contextualizing the feed-forward input, at least during conscious states. And the microcircuit of that integration might align to the layer 5 pyramidal cell and their calcium spike integration mechanism. And you have heard from yesterday the dendritic integration theory background to this. This is neutral to, it can align to IIT or the global workspace theory, but it's, so to say, a proposed microcircuit that underlies this consciousness mechanism and also aligns to what we are seeing with this top-down superficial layer predictive code that we can decode. So we have evidence in mice for this occlusion process. From Peter Rolfsummer's lab and Matthew Self, we also have monkey data recording. There, the recordings are in layers 5, so in the deeper layers. And you see also this second wave. So this looks as if it's evidence for apical drive, if you like. So some of this apical activity is then triggering some spiking response. So this red line is purely feedback triggered. It has also a delay. So in the monkey, you see the delay between the rise time of 42 milliseconds to 74 milliseconds in the occluded. So that's comparable. And we have compared, that's unfortunately not on the slide, but we have compared the kind of pattern of activity in monkeys using dissimilarity matrices and the pattern of dissimilarity in humans in this early phase and late phase. So after the feedback comes into the occluded areas, their dissimilarity patterns in monkeys are similar to the ones in humans. So you can infer that their mental line drawings are also similar. We did this psychophysics with the filling in of the mental line drawings and extensive brain imaging with layers, and also with Lucy Petro with the precision. For example, we know that there's a precision of feedback around 4 degrees. and various other controls that we have done over the years. We've also created a computational model for this feedback mechanism. There are two mechanisms of feedback drive. I mentioned feedback drive already earlier. One is here a contextual illusion, which is called neon color spreading. So you can see this green disk on top of those rings. And in this area around here, we can have evidence for the filling in of the illusory contours, shown here in blue. Again, in superficial layers, we can decode whether this square is green or red in an area that is not stimulated. But in this experiment, we also compared this illusion-related contextual feedback to one that is driven by will. And that is, we instructed the subject to try to imagine a green or red disk in the total darkness. And they imagine it here in the center, unfortunately not overlaying with here, so we had to look at a different adjacent region in V1. And you can see the imagery response in decodability, whether they imagine green or red. So we can read out the content of the imagery in deep layers. We replicated this finding with readjusting the location, so now it's in one patch, both of the effects, and we replicate the illusory contours shown in blue in superficial layers, but the willful imagination, whether something is green or red, is significant in the deep layers. So it's a different mechanism for imagining something relative to the contextual filling in, or yeah. So, how long do I have?
Well, 10 minutes talk and 5 minutes questions.
Yeah, okay, so I have another 5 minutes, right?
Huh?
Do I have another 5 minutes, is that?
Not
10, all right, okay, fine. Great, thanks. So now we have two feedback pathways, just to summarize that, right? So we have one feedback that is automatic and linked to the visual stimuli, contextualizes that in conscious state, and we have the second one that can be utilized for mind wandering and imagining a green or imagining anything. We're expanding this in further research to have like a virtual reality in which we have the drive of the immediate feedback and the imaginary, like thinking about something else. So we make this more realistic to work with these two feedback streams. But then there's one line of research where I was thinking about what is the function of consciousness. One was mentioned to be situated and to be adequately situated. But there's also by carefully selecting certain stimuli, whether they are selected or not selected for consciousness, how does that affect the interpretation of the world? So here we used an apparent motion paradigm. So if you fixate in the middle, you see these dots subsequently blinking, and what your visual system does is it has a kind of prediction along the apparent motion path, so also including the path in between. And, oops, did it stop? And it also, well, it works best if it's regularly. So I'm not sure with the transmission of the projector and so on. So it should regularly go up and down, and then you have this illusion that the grating also smoothly changes. So in the middle of the pathway, it is this kind of pattern that is expected. And that's important because it means you create the feedback and creates again a new feature. So it's not just contextual neighborhood integration, but it's constructing something that makes sense. We have used a more simpler version of that in which we present a fast and a slow version. I think because it's a laser pointer, it doesn't start this animation now. Okay, well, there's a space-time plot, and in in a fast and a slow version, we can introduce a intermediate stimulus that is along the apparent motion path, shown here in dark, or outside, shown at the same location, so that's time and that's space. So at the same location, you can just place it one frame later or one frame earlier, and ask the subject just to detect the blinking spot in the intermediate space. And subjects are more tuned to find the stimulus that fits the spatial temporal pattern of the apparent motion, shown in schizophrenic patients and here in control subjects, and we have shown this across several experiments. I'm somehow intrigued that okay. So here the test stimulus now and then appears in the upper, and is in time, so it's a little bit easier to see than in the lower example. There it appears closer to the lower induced stimulus, and if you look directly to it, you will see the target, but if you fixate in the experiment, it's a little bit in the periphery, and it's harder to detect. And, well, essentially you see how the prediction of up and down motion helps to capture evidence that is in favor of it, and you can perceptually, see that better. Now, we played around with different temporal frequencies of the stimulus, and you have a very strong perception when it's very fast, and as it goes further away, slower, this apparent motion can break down. We asked the subject to report whether they see the illusion, and we recorded whether they detect the target stimulus. And what we found is that if no motion is perceived, it's only the very fast apparent motion where they have this advantage of the in time versus out of time. So the in time is shown in the dark line, and there they have this predictability, or your internal model is so strong for a fast one, it makes a difference. But not for the slower ones. If motion is perceived, if you have a conscious representation of this feature motion, then it helps to predict and extract this fitting stimulus. So it helps to expand over time. And you can think for cortex and for an animal that it's important to have a conscious representation of the outside environment that lasts over time, that has an expansion over time of an interpretation, and to see the world as a function of your internal models. And with this, I come to the last example in which feedback is overwriting and feed-forward stimulus, or feed-forward breakthrough. This is work in progress using motion-induced blindness. So take a look at the fixation, and after a while you will see that one or two of those gratings shown to the left upper or right upper will start to disappear, or will disappear for a while. So they don't really disappear, of course, so it's likely that this information of the grating comes into early visual cortex, but they disappear from consciousness. And we use the experiment in different ways in which we have the gratings left or right turned, and we use the brain imaging data to decode whether the grating is left or right. So the question is, do we still have specific brain activity that's specific to the stimulus, even though you don't see it anymore? And we do this again layer specifically in early visual cortex. And what we find, as preliminary still, this is from 10 subjects, but it looks as if once it's visible, in the red situation, you have the same decodability across the different layers in cortex. But if you have the visual illusion, so the feedback streams are overwriting the interpretation of the feed forward, you can think of it just feeds into the mid layers and gets stuck there, lingers there. It's still specific to grating and to orientation, but it's not captured, it's not taking up from the contextual feedback. Therefore, it doesn't become conscious, but it's decodable in the mid layers, but not in the deep and superficial layers. And so with that, I want to wrap up. I've shown that there's contextual feedback from auditory to support a very shallow account of consciousness, which is the support of sense of space, but feeding into early visual cortex. In the case of amodal completion, amodal means you don't have a perception of those illusory contour of this filling in. World knowledge tells you that there is stuff behind an occluder, but you don't see it. So there's no conscious feature reflection of the completion, but still it is there in visual cortex to situate you in the situation to make world knowledge available and support contextual processing. There's this conscious internal models. So now you're aware of a feature of motion, and it describes a function, and that is the function. It helps you to have a prolonged prediction and to make an interpretation of the outside world imprinted coming from your internal models. You believe there's a motion. It's an illusion, but it's a motion. And that makes you see the world differently depending on that feature being actively represented in you as a conscious feature. And then the fourth level is you have a conscious internal model that is so strong it overrides evidence of the in the motion-induced blindness case, in which the evidence of the gratings is overwritten, and the internal model of your interpretation of a moving grating is kept. And we think we have evidence that that kind of overwriting is happening in V1, in which it doesn't reach the superficial or the deep layers. There you have the interpretation from other areas and writing or getting rid of this feed-forward input. And back to the microcircuit of consciousness, all of the data seems to suggest that it fits beautifully to the dendritic integration theory, that by itself also fits to other accounts like Global Workspace or IIT. To differentiate between those accounts, you need to specify more specific experiments, which we are also doing in collaboration with Melanie and others, but that's for a different talk. And thank you for your attention, and thanks my lab for many of these data and the collaborators.